passed by the United States Senate last week. Included in this year's defense spending bill, the Fentanyl Act would disrupt the trafficking rings and supply chains that are bringing lethal fentanyl into the United States and the Garden State. Secondly, and just as important, we're here today to raise awareness about fentanyl and other dangerous opioids that are taking far too many lives, far too soon. To me, this is an issue that can be told in stark numbers and dramatic increases. A little over a decade ago, fentanyl accounted for just 4% of drug overdoses in New Jersey. In 2019, according to the state's Attorney General, that number stood at 75%. That's right, 75%. Nationwide overdose rates more than doubled in that time frame. And in 2021, the last year for which we have concrete data, nearly 107,000 Americans lost their lives to an overdose. These numbers have only continued to rise due to the pervasive use and distribution of fentanyl. A fatal dose of fentanyl is just 2 milligrams, a quantity roughly the same size as the year that is stamped on every penny. And when mixed into other illicit drugs or counterfeit prescriptions, the toxic combination makes it not only extremely unpredictable, but also extremely dangerous. Again, we're talking about a substance that is cheap to manufacture, easy to conceal, and lethal in amounts smaller than a grain of rice. Last year, federal agents seized enough illegal fentanyl to kill every single American living in our country. More than 379 million doses. That fact alone should stop us all in our tracks. It's an issue that goes beyond politics, beyond party labels, Democrats or Republicans, no matter who we are or where we live, we're all Americans first. And given the threat that fentanyl poses to our country, particularly young people in our country, we must immediately focus our efforts and marshal all of our energy to stop the flow of fentanyl. To that end, I was proud to vote last week on legislation that included the Fentanyl Act, which I sponsored in the Senate. This bipartisan bill enacts strict sanctions to target the financial assets of the opioid trackers driving this devastating epidemic. By enhancing laws currently on the books, the Fentanyl Act will crack down on money laundering and disrupt its illegal supply chains and trafficking rings. By empowering the federal government to fully prosecute the manufacturers, suppliers, and smugglers of this poison, it will better safeguard American communities. And by targeting fentanyl and its revenue streams, the bill will protect our national security while also giving domestic law enforcement the tools it needs to meet this issue head on. Simply put, the Fentanyl Act deserves to be signed into law without delay. Because every day we wait is a day that our justice system is ill-equipped to tackle this deadly epidemic. As I've said, this issue requires an all-hands-on-deck approach, which is why I'm heartened that last month, New Jersey's Attorney General announced the seizure and takedown of an alleged drug production and distribution facility in Patterson. As part of the arrest, 800,000 fentanyl doses were taken off the streets. It's a victory for public safety, one that comes on the heels of a federal indictment that charged 15 people for their role in the trafficking conspiracy. As the U.S. Attorney for New Jersey said in his announcement, quote, "These defendants were affiliated with a street gang that trafficked fentanyl, an extremely dangerous synthetic opioid that can kill users with a single dose. We have no higher priority than taking apart those gangs and addressing the drivers of violence," end quote. The fact of the matter is this: every time our brave men and women in law enforcement can take down dealers and suppliers in a fentanyl ring, we go a long way towards protecting American families and communities from the ravages of opioids. Fentanyl as a drug is 100 times stronger than morphine, 50 times more powerful than heroin. A single dose can be lethal, hence the need to crack down on both fentanyl trafficking as well as the money laundering that supports it. This has been a top priority of mine for years. In 2019, I helped author the landmark Fentanyl Sanctions Act, the first major bipartisan effort to crack down on international fentanyl trafficking. As chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, one of the first hearings we held this year was on illicit trafficking of fentanyl. We heard testimony that day from the head of the Drug Enforcement Administration, Ann Milgram, who is a former state attorney general here in New Jersey. We need to confront fentanyl both domestically and internationally, and I bring that perspective every day to my work in Washington. Before I turn to our next speaker, I just want to end with this. I'm a firm believer that we need to draw a clear line between going after fentanyl and going after those suffering from addiction and substance use disorders. The former is our focus, as it should be. But we should never mix up, and we can learn from the past on this, any effort to be tough on fentanyl with strategies that stigmatize getting help and treatment. Substance abuse is an illness that does not discriminate. It affects the rich and poor, black and white, Latino communities alike. It doesn't matter, it doesn't discriminate. Victims of fentanyl overdoses have been household names like Prince. And they've also been hometown heroes, loved and cared for by a close circle of friends and family. If we are to turn the tide on rising drug overdoses in America, then we have to treat this issue as the comprehensive public health issue that it is. I've been thinking about this as I prepared for today's event, especially after coming across the stories of the two young men whose mothers are here today. By all accounts, Max Lenowitz and Dan Schreffler never met each other. In fact, they grew up on opposite ends of New Jersey. But despite this, they shared a number of traits and similarities. They both were kind and generous. They both were adored by their parents and their two siblings. They are not and should not be defined by the way in which they left us. So let me just say, both to Patrice and Michelle, what you've done to honor the memory of your boys is nothing short of heroic. Out of immeasurable pain, you have found incredible purpose. Your work has no doubt saved lives, in doing so bringing us closer to the day when no parent and no family ever has to endure the loss of someone to fentanyl. I salute you both, and we're honored to stand shoulder to shoulder with you as we work towards that shared goal. We know the path ahead, we know it's arduous, and our work continues. Now, before I introduce Captain Petrowski, let me, because I understand Univision is taking some remarks, so let me just synthesize what I just said in Spanish. Estamos aquí hoy en las oficinas de la Policía Estatal de New Jersey, con familias que han perdido un querido al fentanilo, en un esfuerzo de una nueva ley que el Senado termina de pasar, que espero que va a ser ley, donde ataca a los distintos elementos del proceso en el cual el fentanilo llega a los Estados Unidos, a los traficantes de fentanilo, a esos que lo distribuyen, a esos que están haciendo dinero sobre este tema. Y nuestros esfuerzos para sancionar y ayudar a los cuerpos policíacos poder combatir esta tragedia que tenemos del fentanilo en los Estados Unidos es de suma importancia, porque es una droga que actualmente mata, con menos de una grano de arroz. Enseña la capacidad de matar que existe. Y las dos madres que están aquí hoy, que perdieron sus hijos, son testimonios de por qué tenemos que hacer todo lo posible para luchar contra esa tragedia. With that, let me introduce Captain Jason Petrowski of the New Jersey State Police.